reading Bella Balaj, Early Film Theory, Visible Man, and The Spirit of Film, edited by Erica Carter, work by Bella Balaj. Introduction, Erica Carter. When, in spring 1945, Bela Balázs returned to the Budapest after over 25 years of enforced estrangement from his native Hungary, he started a campaign for recognition that would absorb much of his creative energy during the remaining 4 years of his life. Exiled in the Soviet Union since 1931, Balázs had seen his pre war dream of a progressive cultural internationalism wither in the face of European fascism, a genocidal war, and Soviet state repression. Efforts to publish his major work of film theory had borne fruit at last in the publication of Iskustvo Kino, The Art of Film, a compendium and extension of his earlier film theoretical writings, first touted for publication in 1936, and appearing finally in Russian in 1945. The book's poor reception in the Soviet Union set Balázs on a course towards what would become his magnum opus, a revised theoretical work published in Hungarian in 1948 as Film Cultura, a film művészet filozófiája. Film Culture, the Aesthetic Philosophy of Film. Alongside lecture tours, film and theater projects, and lobbying efforts for official recognition in Hungary, Balázs now mobilized a network of transnational contacts to promote this new volume as the vehicle for the recuperation of the leftist international humanism that had animated his pre war activities as film theorist, novelist, and fairy tale author, playwright, opera librettist, poet, film director, screenwriter, culture activist, and critic. Hence the rash of post war correspondence in the Balázs archive in Budapest, letters to and from distant friends and colleagues saluting the publication of Film Cultura or offering it for translation into French, 1948, German, 1949, Italian, 1952, and English, 1952. One letter of recommendation from the Swiss author Edwin Arnett summarizes the contribution to a post war European film cultural renaissance that Balázs's contemporaries saw as embodied in his film writings. Quote, her Balázs's two books, Visible Man and The Spirit of Film, belong among the classics of film literature. The high quality of observation in his intellectual works on film has, in my view, yet to be surpassed by other works of film philosophy, end quote. For Arnett, Balázs's early works are further distinguished by a, quote, talent for formulation and definition, end quote. That makes reading them a, quote, singular pleasure, end quote. Quote, her Balázs, he continues, writes not only for film critics and theorists, but for a broad readership that transcends the, quote, inner circle of cinephiles, conventionally addressed by philosophical works on film. Anglophone readers have for many decades been denied the, quote, singular pleasure, end quote, to which Arnett refers. The English language version of Film Cultura, Theory of the Film, 1952, does reproduce, sometimes verbatim, lengthy passages from the two works that made Balázs a central figure in the developing film aesthetics of the German-speaking world. Der Sichtbare Mensch, Visible Man, 1924, and Der Geist des Films, The Spirit of the Film, 1930. But those passages give only partial insight into the mode of engaged theoretical writing that Balage's earlier work attempts, a mode characterized, as Arnett rightly notes, by a vivid address to the larger public whom Balages wishes to engage in dialogue on the aesthetic and cultural potential of the infant medium of film. The translation lag in Balage's reception has led in turn to his positioning as a formalist concerned primarily with the abstract grammar of the film medium, or a cultural essentialist whose preoccupations with the film image's quote soul end quote and quote beauty end quote seem to sit easily or uneasily with Anglophone film theory's later post-structuralist or cultural materialism or materialist turns. I'll read it back. Where did that begin? Oh, the translation lag in Balage's reception has led in turn to his positioning as a formalist concerned primarily with the abstract grammar of the film medium, or a cultural essentialist whose preoccupations with the film's image's quote soul end quote and quote beauty end quote seem to sit uneasily with Anglophone film theory's later post-structuralist or cultural materialist turns. That the time may be ripe for a re-engagement with Balage is suggested by revived scholarly interest since the turn of the millennium in his earlier works. The German publishing house Suhrkamp published new editions in 2001 of both Visible Man and The Spirit of Film. That same year, under the editorship of the Balage biographer Hanno Lowy, the independent Berlin publishers Das Arsenal launched a series of new editions of Balage's fairy tale stories, novels, and journalistic feuilletons. Early 21st century translations have included new Italian and Hungarian editions of Visible Man and Anglophone critical interest, which had simmered since the late 1980s among scholars of Weimar film, gained further impetus with the publication in 2006-2007 of English language extracts from Balage's film theory and cultural essays in two major journals, October and Screen. A number of factors underpin this renewed interest in Balage. Balage's early works appeared in a period of accelerated technological development that witnessed the emergence of the quote unchained camera end quote experiments with stereoscopic film, color, and widescreen, and most lamentably, from the perspective of early theories that located the specificity of film art in its status as image. The coming of sound for Balage, the coming of sound. For Balage, moreover, theory writing was no academic pursuit, but a creative practice fashioned first in the Vienna cafes, where he penned his early film reviews for the Daily Der Tag, then polished in a process of productive attrition between his speculative theorizing and practical engagement as screenwriter, director, and translator, and promoter of key works of Soviet film. Both Visible Man and The Spirit of Film are peppered with allusions to his own screenplays, including Die Abenteuer eines Zen Mock Shines Adventures of a 10-Mark Note, 1926, Grand Hotel, 1927, and Narcosis, 1929. Redolent also with the piquancy of his experiences of a film practice mobilized for revolutionary ends, including in his rare screen appearance in Sergei Eisenstein's lost political farce, The Storming of La Sarraz, 1929. Balage's early film theory thus invites a reading as the product of a practice of cultural production that drew on its author's first-hand experience of film technology and creative practice, and embodied his ambition that his writings might help shape the medium's future development. 21st century film theory, it has been suggested, stands at a similar crossroads to that confronting Balage in the heady period of the first emergence of the moving image. The digital revolution, as Francesco Cassetti has observed, has produced an instability both in film theory's object of study and in the practice and institution of film theory itself. As the film medium disperses across multiple platforms, the digital cinema, home computers, the internet, digital television, cable TV, mobile phones, so too film theory becomes a, quote, dispersed object, end quote, split between abstruse reinventions of grand theory and empirical research that, quote, prioritizes, quote, case studies, end quote, over general analysis, end of quote, building, quote, local and localized models, end quote, that condemn film scholars to, quote, investigating fragments without being aware of their specific role in the larger framework of which they are part, end quote. One response to the uncertainty Cassetti describes has been an exploration of the lessons taught by history on the relation of film theory to the moving image screen. Lee Grieveson and Haiti Wasson's Inventing Film Studies is one example of a contemporary volume whose investigation of, quote, tendencies that have constituted film as an object of study, end quote, is conducted with the polemical intent of, quote, generating discussion about why the knowledge we generate matters and what the politics of the knowledge is within and outside the university, end quote. A similar polemic infuses Annette Kuhn's Demand in an essay on the 50-year history of the journal Screen for a history that contemplates not the edifice of, quote, theory, end quote, but the historical practices of, quote, theorizing as an activity that is open and continuing, end quote, and that enables film analysts, therefore, to understand, explain, or indeed to help transform objects of study that are, quote, not only diverse, but also in a process of changing and becoming. Just such a history is offered in this volume. Anglophone scholarship has begun to explore how an engagement with Balage's early work might meet a larger film historical interest in recuperating for contemporary film studies a history of theoretical practice in its relation to early film. In the absence of full English versions of Balage's early writings, however, this work of recuperation remains incomplete. Offered below, therefore, are both the first full English translation of Visible Man and The Spirit of Film, and an introductory essay that contextualizes those works within a historical geography of early 20th century critical intellectual life. The first here is on three features of Balaj's early film theory: his work on the filmic body, the close-up, and montage. These are explored from three corresponding cultural political perspectives. Romantic modernism, Marxism, cultural theory, or romantic modernism, Marxist cultural theory, and cosmopolitan universalism. Those tendencies both animated Balaj's writing on film and provide a context for the exploration of the historical conditions of emergence of a film theory whose author engaged in an active dialogue with a developing film medium, situating his writing, therefore, not as hypothesized theoretical edifice, but as an active force of cultural production in the history of silent and early sound. Balaj as romantic modernist. Bela Balaj was born Herbert Boer, Herbert Boer, to a bilingual German-Hungarian Jewish family in Szeged, Hungary in 1884. His literary career began in 1900 when he submitted his first poem to the local paper, Szegedi Napló, and assumed his Hungarian pen name as the signal of a commitment to a revived vernacular Hungarian tradition. Like many of the radical circles towards which he was to gravitate after his later move to Budapest, Balázs opposed from early on those forms of Magyar cultural nationalism which, while they had fueled 19th century Hungarian liberal opposition to Habsburg rule, also promoted a Biedermeier vision of Hungarian community as split between a folklorist rural peasantry and a bourgeois metropolitan elite. When he won a scholarship in 1902 to the prestigious Eötvös College in Budapest, Balázs was befriended by the composers Bela Bartók and Zoltán Kodály, two figures who would help him refine his alternative utopia of a Hungarian Renaissance rooted in vernacular popular cultural forms. Balázs accompanied Kodály and, on one occasion, Bartók on field trips across the multi-ethnic territories of early 20th century Hungary to collect phonographic recordings and musical transcriptions of Magyar, Romanian, Slavic, Ruthenian, Serbian, Romani, and Arab folk songs. The collection was designed to establish as Hungary's core musical heritage, not the, quote, gypsy, end quote, music of cultural nationalist folklore, but the musical traditions of the rural peasantry. While the two composers drew on that heritage to develop a distinctively modernist percussive and pentatonic compositional style, Balázs turned to poverty, drama, and prose fiction as vehicles for his version of a new Hungarian folk vernacular. Collaboration among the trio bore fruit in musical settings of poems by Bala in his ballet, A Fable Farragut Karalfi, The Wooden Prince, 1917, written specifically for Bartok, and most famously in his secular mystery play, A Kekslava Kalu Herceg Vara, Duke Bluebeard's Castle, 1912, which Balazs dedicated to Bartok and Kodaly and saw adapted by Bartok for his opera of the same name. Balazs' early cultural radicalism found expression then in a romantic commitment to a popular vernacular that drew simultaneously on folk tradition and on a mystical modernism rooted in symbolism and the fin de siècle avant-garde. Another key Balazs associate was the modernist poet André Ade, whose work was indebted, among other influences, to Baudelaire and Verlaine. Bartok drew inspiration from the musical impressionism of Debussy, and Balazs himself based his Duke Bluebeard's Castle on an 1899 version of the Bluebeard legend by the Belgian symbolist Maeterlinck. What drew this group together in the pre-World War I years was a shared belief in the power of artistic utopias and a shared hostility to the twin reactionary forces of a decadent aristocracy and gentry on the one hand, and on the other of folkloristic conservative nationalism. The onset of war, however, would in time lend a revolutionary socio-political dimension to what had until this point been Balazs' predominantly aesthetic critique of Hungarian national cultural norms. In 1915, Balazs joined forces with his other key Budapest intellectual associate Grigory George Lukács to found the Sunday Circle, a loose association of writers, philosophers, scientists, and other intellectuals who met on Sunday afternoons in Balazs' home, alongside Bartok and Kodaly, who visited us occasionally but were by this point no longer Balazs' principal associates. The circle numbered among its members the sociologist Carol Manningham, the poet and illustrator Anna Lesnay, the Marxist art historian Frederick Antal, the writer and philosopher Emma Rittig, and the two women who, along with Balazs and Lukács, formed the group's nucleus. Balazs' wife Edith Hajosh, and the woman whom Edith tolerated as Balazs' lover and who would become his second wife in 1919, Anna Hamvesi. Hanno Lowy sees the Sunday Circle's founding as evidence of Balazs' quote, emphatic turn towards a concrete utopia, end quote, a utopia that foresaw radical cultural transformation, but whose grounding in a metaphysical idealism rendered its protagonist as yet unfit for political action in the turbulent wartime world. When it launched a Free School of the Human Sciences as a public forum for ethical and philosophical debate in 1917. The group, however, began a shift to public engagement that would see many of its members embracing revolutionary struggle in the short-lived Hungarian Commune of 1919. Balázs, indeed, having joined the Hungarian Socialist Party in 1918 and gravitated thence towards revolutionary communism, would join Lukács as a leading functionary in Berghahn's Soviet Republic, taking a role as head of the governing council's literary department and working to disseminate culture to the masses until the Republic's collapse sent him into exile in Vienna in November 1919, alongside Anna Hamvasi and other circle members, including Lukács, Anna Lesnay, and the psychoanalyst Renee Spitz. Although Balázs would not turn to film criticism until his appointment as film reviewer for the Vienna Daily Der Tag in 1922, the earlier story of his formation as public intellectual in the declining decades of Habsburg rule illuminates the material context out of which would emerge his later theory of film. In his post-World War II correspondence, Balázs would refer repeatedly to memories of a Central European cafe society whose key axes were the metropolitan centers of Budapest, Vienna, Prague, Paris, and Berlin. These multi-ethnic, multilingual, and cosmopolitan cities had nurtured Balázs's generation of what Mannheim would later call, quote, free-floating intellectuals, end quote, cultural commentators and practitioners. Balázs, Bartók, Kodály, Lukács, situated at the nodal points of broader transformations in class, social and ethnic structures, and political systems, including in Hungary as across Central Europe, the rise of a new bourgeoisie, partial Jewish assimilation into the bourgeois class, and a burgeoning of nationalist and anti-imperial sentiment. Born out of this, quote, mass of mutually conflicting tendencies, end quote, the intelligentsia of the modern Central Europe metropolis met in informal public venues, the cafe, the theater, the cinema, private homes, to form a heterogeneous collective detached from traditional class, political, and ethnic affiliations, but finding common ground in their pursuit of modernist cultural regeneration. The director, Michael Curtis, would later recall how Budapest Cafe Venedig, Cafe Venice entered cinematic legend in 1911 as the birthplace of Hungarian cinema. On regular evenings, the proprietor, a certain, quote, Herr Angerlader, drew down the blinds and projected flickering images onto a white screen, end quote. When Angerlader later extended to Curtis, quote, a kind invitation to play a role in the first ever cinematic work on Hungarian soil, end quote, his action confirmed the crucial function of the cafe and other informal public venues as, quote, spaces of modernity, end quote, fluid and culturally heterogeneous, sociospatial milieu that marked out new experiential and philosophical horizons for Balaj and Curtis's generation of cultural intellectuals. Just as Curtis's film career grew out of chance meetings in a Budapest cafe, so too Balazs's film theory was born in the marginal cultural spaces of the Central European metropolis. In his Sunday Circle salon, as in the cafes of pre war Budapest and interwar Vienna, intellectual production was organized around romantic ideals of passionate friendship, quote, friendship of the old style, end quote, as Karl Mannheim put it in a later letter to Balázs, among an avant-gardist intelligentsia committed to the utopia of a new cultural subject forged in the, quote, experiential space, end quote, Mannheim, of a heterogeneous mass cultural modernity. From Balazs's correspondence from his early years in exile, there thus emerges a picture of a writer engaged in cultural practices across a range of genres and cultural forms, and in animated dialogue with contemporaries, including the writer Arthur Schnitzler, the feuilletonist Alfred Polger, and the filmmaker Berthold Vertel, with whom he would collaborate as a scriptwriter on Adventures of a 10-Mark Note, as well as now exiled compatriots from his pre-war years in Budapest. As a journalist and critic, Balázs eked out a living after 1919 with contributions to titles including the Viennese Der Tag and Wiener Tageblatt, the Swiss liberal bourgeois Basler National Zeitung, and the German language Budapest daily Pester Lloyd. His work as lyrical poet, dramatist, novelist, and fabulist continued with publications including the Hungarian poetry volume for Fienek Song of a Man, 1923, a collection of Chinese tales, Der Mantel der Traum, The Mantle of Dreams, 1922, Agitprop dramas for the Hungarian and Australian Communist parties, and early forays into screenwriting, including for Hans Otto Lowenstein's Kaiser Karl, Emperor Charles, 1921, Der Abendkampf aus Russland, The Unknown Russian, 1922, and the co-scripted Modern Ehen, Modern Marriages, 1924. Balázs in Jewish Cultural History. Looking back on those heady years of feverish productivity and cultural revolutionary zeal, Balázs would later recall in a letter to Alfred Polgar their, quote, shared evenings at the theater in this city of a humanity that is now long gone, end quote. His reference to a now fragmented, quote, humanity, end quote, points up a second feature of socio-spatial context that was significant for the development of Balázs's film theory from the early 1920s on. Balázs's letter to Polgar was penned from his third exile destination, Moscow, the city in which he hoped, erroneously, as he was soon to discover, to find realized his long-nurtured utopia of a revolutionary mass culture. Leaving Berlin where he had moved in 1926 to immigrate to Moscow in 1931, Balazs now contemplated with horror the Nazi, quote, global witch hunt for Jewish extermination, end quote. Their annexation of Austria in 1938 not only destroyed the informal infrastructure of the Viennese avant-garde, more crucially, it fractured and dispersed the Jewish intellectual networks that had sustained Central European modernism and provided both the local social milieu for Balazs's work in Budapest and Vienna and the setting for his vigorous engagement with transnational intellectual currents that traversed Vienna, Berlin, Paris, Rome, Zurich, and beyond. In his illuminating study of Jewish libertarian thought in Central Europe, Redemption and Utopia, Michael Lowy makes passing reference to Balazs as one figure in the larger story of a blossoming of the Central European Jewish intelligentsia from the mid-19th century to 1933, charting the history of a, quote, generation of dreamers and utopians, end quote, largely German-speaking but scattered across the desperate territories of pre- and post-unification Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. Lowy writes of a, quote, subterranean network of correspondences linking the most creative intellectuals, end quote. His examples include Franz Kafka, Walter Benjamin, Gershom Scholem, George Lukács, and Erich Fromm, and of a, quote, revolutionary social imaginary, end quote, that animated this, quote, new social category, end quote, in its otherwise desperate strands. It was in particular Balazs's friendship with Lukács that made him a ubiquitous presence in the Jewish circles of Lowy's account. The friendship was precipitated by their joint attendance in 1906 through 1907 at the private Berlin seminar of the cultural philosopher George Simmel, the luminary around whom crystallized one of the numerous informal circles that Lowy identifies as pivotal for early 20th century Central European Jewish intellectual life. Other groupings include the Max Weber Circle in Heidelberg, also frequented by Lukács, who studied under Weber, alongside the philosopher Ernst Bloch and the expressionist dramatist Ernst Toller, and the Frankfurt Circle around Rabbi Noble, whose informal members included Siegfried Kracauer, Leo Lowenthal, and Erich Fromm. Balazs and Lukács would move together in these circles, sharing pivotal life experiences, exchanging lovers, and debating matters of philosophy, culture, and politics, until political differences fractured the friendship after their joint participation in the Budapest Commune in 1919. For Lowy, what binds together this dispersed and socially marginal intelligentsia is its commitment to a historically particular blend of Jewish messianism and libertarian social utopia. What united Balazs and Lukács in their Budapest years was thus a common revolutionary consciousness whose cultural roots lay both in Romanticism. Hence, Balazs's commitment in his folk version of Hungarian modernism to a revolutionary culture that also harked back to a utopian pre-capitalist past, and in a mystical modernism that would only belatedly transform into Marxist calls for political action. When Balazs published his first volume of poetry in 1908, Lukács was his most ferocious supporter, writing that, quote, Bela Balázs, in Bela Balázs, the most fundamental and intellectual problems of today's generation are transformed into art, grow into music, end quote. The romanticism of both writers' commitment in this period to art as the vehicle for utopian transcendence of socio-political strife was echoed in their emulation of the wandering life of the romantic traveler, and in a friendship whose passionate nature harked back to the romantic cult of the libidinous homosocial bond. Hence, their avid and often ecstatic correspondence during the pre-World War I years when the two roamed widely across the metropolitan centers that were the core destinations of Lowry's libertarian intelligentsia: Berlin, Frankfurt, Paris, Florence, Budapest. By 1914, however, divergences were apparent. Lukács was moving towards a growing asceticism expressed philosophically in his Die Theorie des Romans, The Theory of the Novel, 1916, in a critique of the, quote, demonic, end quote, quality of the classical novel hero who, quote, chooses the direct, straight path towards the realization of the idea, end quote. Lukács' growing distaste for a cultural utopianism that privileged aesthetic over political ideas was evident also in his often tortured denial of fleshy pleasures, most poignantly expressed in his renunciation of his lover Irma Seidler, who later committed suicide after a brief liaison with Balázs. When Lukács was appointed acting director of the People's Commissariat for Education in spring 1919, his efforts to instigate revolutionary transformation by means of cultural reform did evidence a residual enthusiasm for the socially transformative power of art, with Balázs in tow as director of the literature and arts section of the Commissariat. Lukács nationalized and collectivized all forms of cultural production, took measures to open up arts and educational institutions to the working masses, and declared communism a route to the transcendence of capitalism or of capitalist alienation in a quote society of love, end quote. But the doctrinaire Marxist Lukács of later years would dismiss his activities during the Commune as a naive exercise grounded in a misplaced belief in the revolutionary power of culture. It would be, quote, laughable, end quote, wrote Lukács in his 1970 through 1971 autobiographical manuscript, Gelebte Denken, Lived Thinking, to defend, quote, our attempt to eradicate the commodity character of artworks as a communist measure. On this issue, Lukács would irrevocably part company with Balázs, though the two fled together to Vienna in 1919. They pursued radically different paths. Lukács committed himself increasingly to party politics, working underground and illegally to unite exiled communist factions. Bala, by contrast, continued to espouse a visionary and eschatological Marxism that focused, quote, in the first instance on transforming his own artistic practice and on changing the relationship between the profane world and its symbolic, quote, sacral, end quote, forms, end of quote. Initially, the focus of his writings was on drama, a new novel, fairy stories, and ballet. But when Bala was approached in 1922 to write film reviews for Der Tag, there began a lifelong engagement with a medium that he would come to perceive as realizing the utopian demand, now abandoned by Lukács, but still pursued by other notable figures among Lowry's Central European intelligentsia, most notably Ernst Bloch, for a material realization within contemporary popular culture of revolutionary ideals. The utopian body on film. Between 1922 and 1925, Bala would publish over 200 critical articles on film for Der Tag, alongside essays on fine art, theater, radio drama, and other popular cultural forms. In 1924, those articles became the basis for the first full-length book in the German language on the theory of film, Visible Man. The book is exemplary of the romantic libertarian modernism that underpinned Bala's revolutionary vision in this period, and it is around his idea of the filmic body that this utopian modernism in the first instance circulates. He writes, pages 10 through 11, block quote, "Since the advent of printing, the word has become the principal bridge joining human beings to one another. The soul has migrated into the word and become crystallized there. The body, however, has been stripped of soul and emptied. The culture of words is dematerialized, abstracted, and over-intellectualized. It degrades the human body to the status of a biological organism. But the new language of gestures that is emerging at present arises from our painful yearning to be human beings with our entire bodies from top to toe, and not merely in our speech. We long to stop dragging our body around like an alien thing that is useful only as a practical set of tools. This new language arises from our yearning for the embodied human being who has fallen silent, who has been forgotten and has become invisible." End of block quote. Bala's understanding of film as a medium with the potential to overcome the curse of Babel by reintroducing into culture the universal, quote, language of gestures and facial expressions, end quote, page 10, has resonances with numerous other writers of the period. Vachel Lindsay, Ricciato Canuto, Louis DeLuc, and others who similarly celebrated film as a new universal language. Particular to Balash is his emphasis on print culture's link to capitalism and his understanding of the potential of the filmic body to overcome capitalist alienation, echoing both Marx and Simmel on the abstraction that grounds social interaction in capitalist economies in monetary value alone. Ballage writes of printing as a technology that, quote, accelerated the process of, quote, reification, end quote, the term used by Karl Marx to designate the growth of abstraction, just as in the minds of men in the intrinsic value of objects has been displaced by their market price, so too people's minds have gradually become estranged from the immediate existence of objects in general. It was this intellectual climate that enabled the book culture of later centuries to become so dominant. End of quote. Page 84. In film, by contrast, alienation is being overcome, paradoxically, through the use of a quintessentially modern cultural technology, the moving photographic image, to resuscitate what appears at first glance as a pre-modern mode of embodied experience and expression, the language of, quote, visible man, end quote. Ballage's phenomenology of perception. Ballage repeatedly underlines that the new filmic body is not equivalent to the prelapsarian body of, quote, primitive, end quote, or folk cultures. The historicity of the modern body is underscored first in his comments on the new filmic body language as the product of a, quote, cultural process, end quote, of perception and cognition, in which the, quote, gait and everyday gestures, end quote, of figures encountered on the street, in the family home, or in the moving image are recognized, consciously remembered, then absorbed to become an, quote, instinctive sensibility materialized as culture in the body, end quote, page 13. Secondly, and relatedly, the body in cinema becomes historical through its status as the subject of those new modes of perception that are engendered by film. Significant here is Ballage's repeated allusion to what he terms, quote, apperception, end quote, a perceptual mode that he identifies both with film spectatorship and with sense of perception tout court. Quote, apperception, end quote, was the term used by Kant, among others, to distinguish a mental process that brings sensory awareness of empirical phenomena into association with inner mental processes. As William James put it, apperception describes, quote, the fate of every impression to fall into a mind preoccupied with memories, ideas, and interest, end quote. Thus, sense impressions acquire a, quote, mental escort drawn from the mind's ready-made stock, end quote. James's phenomenological epistemology here refuses empiricist dualism with its separation of the subject of perception, the, quote, mind, end quote, consciousness, end quote, from its object, and considers perceptions of the object world instead to be always already infused with subjective, quote, memories, ideas, and interest, end quote. A similar mistrust of dualist epistemologies informs Ballage's conception of, quote, visible man, end quote. Much of what has often been a philosophical distrust of Ballage has its origins in the insistence that the image on film cannot be read as a linguistic sign arising out of a fundamental splitting image language. A fundamental splitting between language. I'll read it back. Much of what has often been a philosophical distrust of Balaj has its origins in his insistence that the image on film cannot be read as a linguistic sign arising out of a fundamental splitting between language and the unconscious, as in Freud, between a Lacanian symbolic and imaginary, or indeed as the product of a performative practice in which meaning and identity are spoken in discourse. Provocatively, Balaj proclaims instead that in film, quote, the body becomes unmediated spirit rendered visible, end quote, page 9. Balaj's recourse to Jamesian notions of, quote, apperception, end quote, reveals the grounding of this understanding of filmic, quote, spirit, end quote, in a longer phenomenological tradition represented alongside Berghahn and James by such key figures in Balaj's own intellectual development as Simmel and Lukács, or indeed Siegfried Kracauer, though his relations with Balaj were more distant. A further key term from Visible Man points up moreover a second point of origin for Balaj's phenomenological understanding of the, quote, spirit, end quote, of film. In an early passage, Balaj sums up his understanding of how symbolic meaning is generated in the interaction between spectator and film, refusing dualistic conceptions of spectatorship as shifting between what Christian Metz termed primary and secondary identification, from perception by and of the body, then to symbolic identification. Balaj insists that perception itself is always already symbolic, attaching immediately to those, quote, mental escorts, memories, ideas, and interest, end quote, that, as we saw above, William James had insisted were mobilized in the very moment of sense perception. The, quote, decisive fact as far as film is concerned is thus for Balaj that, quote, all objects without exception are necessarily symbolic, for whether we are aware of it or not, all objects make a physiognomical impression upon us. All and always, just as time and space are categories of our understanding and can thus never be eliminated from the world of our experience, so too the physiognomical attaches to every phenomenon. It is a necessary category of our perception, end quote, page 56. Physiognomy in the pragmatic English definition, Balaj's pivotal term in this passage, quote, physiognomy, end quote, refers to a much disparaged essentialist psychology that claims the capacity to read human character from facial features. In Balaj, the term is used quite differently as the hinge that attaches his phenomenological epistemology to a hermeneutics of film, quote, physiognomy, end quote, that is, links theory in Balaj to a practice of film, quote, reading, end quote, understood not as the extraction of meaning from the film text, but as a refined poetics of film reception. Two elements distinguish Balage's conception of physiognomy from its common reduction in the Anglophone context to a characterology of face. The first is his application of the term to the entirety of the diegetic and, indeed, the object world. In his anthropomorphic vision, even, quote, mute objects, end quote, page 23, have, quote, vitality and significance. Every child knows, he continues, block quote, that things have a face, and he walks with a beating heart through the half-darkened room where tables, cupboards, and sofas pull strange faces at him and try to say something to him with their curious expression. Even grown-ups may still glimpse strange shapes in the clouds, but things may also have pleasant and lovable faces. How often are we as cheered by the sight of simple objects as we are by the sight of a friend? For the most part, we do not know why this is. It springs not from any decorative beauty, but rather from the living physiognomy that all things possess. Page 46, author's emphasis, end of block quote. Both Visible Man and The Spirit of Film are peppered with further allusions to what Balage terms the, quote, face of things, end quote. His discussion in Visible Man of the use of long shot to reveal, quote, large entities, end quote, that have hitherto escaped individual human beings, end quote, more restricted visual field includes comments on films of the mass or crowd that revealed the, quote, shapes and physiognomies of human society, end quote. Social groupings as they, quote, have never before been visible in the individualist arts, end quote, and whose, quote, class character, end quote, he will never foreground in his more explicitly political spirit of the film. Page 148. Balage writes, too, in The Spirit of the Film, of physiognomy on a more minute scale, what he terms, quote, microphysiognomy, end quote, the, quote, face, end quote, of inert objects and body parts revealed in close-ups, not as, quote, the face we wear, but our actual visual appearance, end quote, page 104. The mass, the landscape, gestures, and body parts, inert part objects, have a status then in Balage's physiognomy that equals the significance of the face. There may be nothing immediately startling about his observation that film makes meaning through scene dissection or through wide shots, pans, and tracks that establish the space of the action or delineate large entities within it. In Balage's film theory, however, and this is physiognomy's second distinguishing element, what becomes apparent as film technology interacts with objects, bodies, or spaces to produce filmic realities within the mise-en-scène is what Balage variously calls the, quote, mood, end quote, the, quote, atmosphere, end quote, the, quote, micropsychology, end quote, or the, quote, instinctive sensibility, end quote, that reveals itself in the interaction between spectator and film. Physiognomy is distinguished from realism or empiricism then through its status as a mode of aesthetic as opposed to crudely empirical knowing, a mode in which cognition recurs within the context of a perpetual flux of aesthetic value and affect. The intellectual tradition that Balash explicitly names Invisible Man as the point of origin for his physiognomic understanding of aesthetic perception is 18th century philosophical aesthetics. Balash begins the section of his book on, quote, type and physiognomy, end quote, with a quote from Aristotle via Goethe. Block quote: for no animal has ever existed that had the shape of one creature and the habits of another, but each creature has its own body and its own meaning. Thus, every body necessarily determines its nature. If this is true, as indeed is eternally true, then such a thing as physiognomy must exist. It is significant that Balash quotes Goethe here, rather that the acknowledged, quote, father, end quote, of modern physiognomy, the Swiss writer and Protestant pastor Johann Caspar Lavater. Goethe had collaborated with Lavater on the first volume of his monumental physiognomisch fragment, Physiognomical Fragments, 1775 through 1778, a 4-volume exploration of that romantic utopia of a, quote, penetrating inner vision, end quote, to which Balash also would later aspire. Initially enthusiastic about Lavater's, quote, conception of the human being as an entity in which body and soul, an external and internal being, form an inherent unity, Goethe contributed articles to Lavater's first volume and allowed his portrait in profile to be used in a section of volume 3 on poets of genius. But Goethe distanced himself from Lavater as distinctions began to emerge around their conception of the relationship between body and character, personality, or soul. Richard Gray suggested both Goethe and Lavater strove to establish an, quote, identity between inner substance and phenomenal appearance, end quote. But as Gray further elucidates, while Lavater understands the relation between inner and outer substance, quote, semiotically, end quote, such that bodily phenomena become the, quote, sign of a transcendental content, end quote. Goethe developed physiognomy as what Gray terms a, quote, syntactics, end quote, in which every bodily element, quote, stands in a dialectical and mutually determining relationship with a hypothetical conception of the whole, end quote. For Goethe, the unity between body and mind, physical form, and spiritual essence remained then in a permanent state of becoming. As Goethe himself wrote, quote, nature forms human beings, but they in turn transform themselves. Goethe's skepticism over Lavater's ontology developed in part through studies in comparative anatomy, in which he elaborated his syntactics of the body with reference to conceptions of, quote, gestalt, end quote. Goethe arrived at an understanding of gestalt, or, quote, form, end quote, not as the frozen sign of transcendental essence or spirit, but instead as a fleeting presence within the perpetual flux of natural or organic life. As he writes, quote, if we examine all forms, gestalten, especially organic ones, we find there is nothing that simply persists, nothing that is at rest or complete. Rather, everything is in a state of constant flux. If we want to introduce a type of morphology, then we must not speak of form, gestalt, but rather, when we use this word, we must associate it only with the idea, the concept, or with something that can be held fast as an empirical phenomenon only for a moment. What is formed is immediately transformed, and we remain just as mobile and plastic if we want to attain a living intuition. Lebende Anschauung of nature, end quote. There are clear resonances here with Balage's conception of film as a cultural technology that situates the human body in a transformed relationship with history's perpetual flux. Balage recognized increasingly how fundamental was the transformation that the film medium effected in human perceptual faculties and sensory experience. He was fascinated, for instance, by war footage shot by dying soldiers, or films from polar expeditions in which Captain Scott or Shackleton, quote, as good as shoot the scene of their own death, end quote. Evidenced here, claimed Balage, in the spirit of film was, block quote, a new form of human consciousness that has been vouchsafed to man by the camera. For as long as these men do not lose consciousness, they keep their eye to the lens and use the camera image to make their situation a perceptible reality. Presence of mind becomes living image, and the quote clear gaze, end quote, of inner scrutiny, which used to involve an internal sequence of images, becomes a roll of film loaded into a camera. It functions mechanically. The cameraman does not shoot as long as he is conscious. He remains conscious as long as he continues to shoot. Page 157 in the block quote. This is one of many instances in which Bala repudiates a dualistic understanding of technology versus nature, or mediated versus unmediated perception, and presents a vision instead of the film camera as a technological instrument whose movement between embodied and disembodied states 1 minute it lies dormant and the next it sees with human eyes, blurs the boundaries between body and technology, inner and outer worlds. A further example, Balage's more general but related observation that in film, quote, the camera takes my eye along with it. I see the world from within the filmic space, end quote. Page 99, has often been cited as a prefiguring of Christian Metz's notion of a primary form of cinematic identification in which the spectator adopts the position of the camera and identifies, quote, with himself, a pure act of perception, end quote. It is for Balage, however, not only the camera, but also montage and sound that traverse the boundaries between interior and exterior. In montage, the editor's scissors may be deployed to cut together, quote, the series of images that arise in our minds as an internal montage of the conscious and the unconscious, end quote. Page 125. In sound, similarly, the camera operator may make creative use of the microphone to, quote, lead our ears as the camera led our eyes in the silent film, end quote. Page 185. The fairy tale close-up. In a recent study of the, quote, relationship of Marxist thought to the phenomena of everyday life and utopia, end quote, Michael E. Gardiner echoes Michael Lowy in linking such contemporaries of Balazs as Lukács, Semel, Bloch, and Benjamin to a philosophical tradition that is suspicious of the, quote, pervasive dichotomy, end quote, in modern Western thought, quote, between the everyday/immanent and the utopian/transcendent, end quote. This Central European tendency commits itself instead to an, quote, everyday utopianism, end quote, that seeks out as the source of social transformation, quote, a series of forms, tendencies, and possibilities that are immanent in the here and now. Balazs's writing on the filmic body locates his film theory squarely within that tradition. We have seen how Balazs draws on contemporary phenomenology and classical aesthetics to forge a utopian version of a cinematic body that overcomes empiricist dualism and the reification of the written word. The particularity of Balazs's contribution to utopian Marxism lies, however, in the grounding of his bodily utopia in minute accounts of the new film language and of the dynamic interplay across and between physical bodies. The bodies of the actor, the filmmaker, the spectator, the object world, the film image, film technology, and subjective perception. Balazs has been most enduringly remembered in the history of film theory for his contributions on the close-up, and indeed Balazs himself, Invisible Man, affirms the centrality of the close-up in his film theory when he terms the close-up shot, quote, film's true terrain, page 38. Often unexplored in film history, however, is the relation between Balazs's account of the close-up and his utopian understanding of the new perceptual economy generated for the 20th century human subject by film. It has been something of a habit in film studies to talk of the close-up as a moment of spectacle that arrests temporal development in narrative film. Balazs's account is quite different. For him, the close-up shifts film into a different temporality that is, importantly, also one source of the medium's utopian potential, discussing a number of titles including Murnau's Phantom, 1922, Griffith's Way Down East, 1920, and Intolerance, 1916. Balazs draws a comparison in Visible Man between the close-up and the lyric form. The close shot for Balazs is the, quote, lyrical essence of the entire drama, end quote, page 37, a technical device that locates the film image not within the linear time of narrative or epic, but in the temporality of affect and the dream. Witness, for instance, Balazs discussing the face of Lillian Gish in Griffith's Way Down East, describing a passage in which the ingenue Gish discovers that the man to whom she believes herself to be married has tricked her with a staged wedding ceremony. He writes, page 35, emphasis Balazs, block quote, when the man tells her that he has deceived her, she knows what he says is true, but wants to believe that he is just joking. And for 5 whole minutes, she laughs and cries by turns at least a dozen times. We would need many printed pages to describe the storms that pass over this tiny, pale face. But the nature of these feelings lies precisely in the crazy rapidity with which they succeed one another. The effect of this play of facial expressions lies in its ability to replicate the original tempo of her feelings. That is something that words are incapable of. The description of a feeling always lasts longer than the time taken by the feeling itself. The rhythm of our inner turbulence will inevitably be lost in every literary narrative. This is one of numerous passages where Balazs identifies the close up or end of block quote. This is one of numerous passages where Balazs identifies the close up as the space of a different, specifically filmic time. Though his account of the close up has yet to be fully elaborated in Visible Man, he does begin to identify here the aesthetic qualities of the close shot that shifted it to the quote time space end quote of poetry, page 73. Balazs quotes Walt Whitman as a source when he identifies simultaneity as a first feature of the close-up's temporal organization. Unlike either Eisenstein or Abel Gance, whose efforts in LaRue, The Will, 1923, to evoke simultaneous time with rapid crosscuts are the probable origin of comments on Gance in Visible Man, page 70. Balazs insists that it is the close shot, not montage, that is the privileged site of simultaneity in film. His observations on the rapid play of emotions across the face of Gish typify Balazs' early view of the facial close-up, in particular as an aesthetic space where the, quote, most varied emotions, end quote, are displayed, quote, simultaneously like a chords of feeling whose essence is in fact their simultaneity, end quote, page 34. The analogy with music is carried through in Balazs' comments on the polyphony, end quote, of the close-up, its capacity to pick out and recombine in one great, quote, symphony, end quote, the, quote, individual cells of life, end quote, that in a montage of close-ups can convey, quote, the texture and substance of life in its concrete detail, end quote, page 38. The close-up's simultaneous temporality does not, however, release objects in close-up from the movement of time. Instead, the close-up brings to light the movements of subjective affect, the, quote, tempo of the feelings, end quote, the, quote, rhythm of inner turbulence, end quote, that Balazs finds so exquisitely conveyed in the play of emotions across the face of Lillian Gish. The Balazs of Visible Man had broken links with Bartok and Kodaly, having taken offense somewhat naively given the hostility of the Horthy regime under which both composers still lived, over their hesitancy at publicly acknowledging their debt to the exiled Balazs. But in his comments on the close-up, echoes remain of Balazs' early collaborations with Bartok and of his embracing in that context of folk tales, mystery plays, and fairy tales as socially transformative literary forms. Balazs' first full-length fable, A Send, The Silence, had been completed in 1910, though never published in full during his lifetime. The Silence presaged what was to become an enduring commitment on Balazs' part. He continued writing fairy tales throughout his literary career, publishing his first volume, Het Mees, 7 Fairy Tales, in 1918, and continuing through a series of further works, including his 1922 Oriental Fantasia, The Mantle of Dreams. The extended fable Das richtige Himmelblau, The Real Sky Blue, 1925, and illustrated children's stories published during the 10-year Moscow sojourn after 1931. Balage's preoccupation with the fairy tale is perhaps most famously evident in his collaboration with Leni Riefenstahl as co-director and co-screenwriter for the visionary mountain film Das Blue Light, The Blue Light, 1932. But his fairy tale fascination was not limited to fictional narrative. It also begins to explain his preoccupation with the close-up in film. The fairy tale, of course, has a long history in Central European and especially German literary culture as the focus of utopian social aspirations. The Brothers Grimm and other romantics used folk and fairy tales to trace the contours of a future national culture in a unified Germany. But they also mobilized these archaic forms, as Jack Ziepes observes, quote, to comment on the Philistinism of the German bourgeois and its pervasion or in its perversion of Enlightenment ideals, end quote. Both these elements of the fairy tale, its rooting in a socially progressive popular culture and its critique of an alienated and perverted modernity, help explain the genre's attraction for Balage, as well as his hopes for a sublation of the fairy tale's potential in the new medium of film. The fairy tale prefigures, for instance, many features of the close-up's organization of time, mirroring the simultaneous temporality of the close-up. The fairy tale narrative progresses not through links of cause and effect, but through magical transformations in which the present becomes the past or future by means of enchanted mirrors, magic wands, or other supernatural interventions. A similar affinity is evident in the close-up spatialization of time. In the close-up, narrative time collapses into the space of a single shot. Thus, Gish's expressive face in Way Down East encapsulates the entirety of an innocent woman's shattered life. Analogously, in the fairy tale, past, present, and future coexist in enchanted spaces. Bluebeard's castle is one where present events are haunted by an omnipresent past, and where the future is accessed across spatial thresholds, not through developments in narrative time. Balage's 1910 Bluebeard libretto, indeed, lends itself to a reading as an allegorical prefiguring of Visible Man's account of the close-up in film. In his 1924 text, Balage will write of the close-up as a magical space in which relations of time and space are transformed and boundaries broken. His version of the castle in the Bluebeard myth is similarly enchanted. Already in the opera's spoken prologue, attention is drawn to the possibility of a fluid movement between inner and outer worlds within the space of the castle stage. Quote, now hear the song, you look, I look at you. Our eyes, curtain, the eyelashes, opens. Where is the stage? Outside or inside? Men and women? Question mark. End quote. That the product of this dissolution of boundaries between individual and collective, audience and stage, will be a suffusion of the object world with subjective affect is confirmed with the castle itself becomes a protagonist in Bluebeard's drama. The opera opens on Bluebeard's entry with his new wife Judith into the somber half darkness of a brooding medieval castle with 7 enormous, undecorated doors. When Judith calls for the doors to be opened to flood the castle with light, it is not only Bluebeard who recoils in horror at the bloody secrets she will uncover. The 3 murdered ex wives whose uncanny presence lurks behind the castle's 7th door. The castle itself becomes an animate object, sweating, weeping, moaning, sighing, and bleeding to a musical score that amplifies its anguish with minor key motifs. And before the opening of the final door, a quote, circling orchestral ostinato saturated with the blood motif, end quote. In his own notes on the German translation of the libretto, Balaj comments, quote, I called Bluebeard a stage ballad because the stage here is not simply the necessary space for the enchantment of dialogue. The stage is a participant, the Hungarian dramatist persona, named 3 characters, Bluebeard, Judith, and the castle. Bluebeard allows the wife he loves entry into this castle, into his soul, and this castle, the stage, trembles and sighs and bleeds. Within its walls, what the woman walks on is living matter, end quote. We can see this animation of the castle, its dissolution of the boundaries between human and non-human worlds, as prefiguring Balaj's anthropomorphic understanding of the close-up invisible man. His vision of the facial close-up in particular as a shot that moves with the quote life, end quote tempo, end quote, and quote vitality, end quote, of the living world, page 73. Bluebeard's collapsing of past and future time, the past of Bluebeard's atrocities, and the future of Judith's fate into the simultaneous time space of the visible present also foreshadows Balaj's observation that, quote, by inserting the action into a spatial perspective that evinces no sign of a before and after, end quote, the close shot becomes a, quote, simultaneous representation that nullifies all sense of time, end quote, page 71. The close-up and Berghahn. This introduction has so far highlighted aspects of the close-up's temporality that locate the shot within the tradition of the fairy tale and thus help explain Balaj's utopian aspirations for film as the form that will realize the revolutionary dream of a culture created by and for the popular mass. Yet already in Visible Man, Balaj hints at a second source for his thinking on the close-up. Its origin not only in his early fascination with the fairy tale, but in contemporary writings on the phenomenology of time, presaging the future direction of his writing on the close-up. Balaj writes here of the close shots that do not simply collapse time into the simultaneous space of the images present, but that transform the very substance of the image. In a passage of filmic representations of dream states, Balaj offers a distinction between, quote, fairy tale images, end quote, that signal their dream status by mere changes in form, and images that reproduce, quote, the changed substance that is the characteristic of the dream figure, end quote, page 49. This, quote, substance, end quote, derives, he continues, from movements within the close-up. Once again, the face of Lillian Gish may serve as an example that reproduce the quote rhythm end quote and quote tempo end quote of the dream. It is a feature of film's character as moving image. In other words, that it can reproduce quote dream figures end quote identifiable as such becomes or because they quote move differently, their rhythm does not conform to the laws of motion in the physical world, but to the internal rhythms of the mental world end quote, page 49. Balazs returns to the topic in an extended section on, quote, the close-up, end quote, in the spirit of film, and it is here that he explains a shift in the thinking that has the close-up no longer necessarily inhabiting a space-time of simultaneity where past and future collapse into the present moment of the shot. More boldly, Balazs now asserts that what we may enter not only in the dream images discussed in Visible Man, but also in the facial close-up, is a new dimension of emotional experience that lies wholly outside the time-space of empirical experience, while close-ups of objects or body parts, a hand, a table, are still, quote, seen to exist in space, end quote, because, quote, a hand, even if depicted in isolation, signifies a human being. A table, likewise, in isolation, signifies its function in a space, end quote. The facial close-up, quote, acquires expression and meaning without the addition of the imaged spatial context, end quote, page 100. The facial close-up then affords the possibility of an emotional expressivity that is detached from time and space and exists instead in a dimension of emotional experience that Balazs describes as, quote, physiognomic, end quote. His amplified understanding of physiognomy in the spirit of film locates it no longer simply as an intuitive grasp of mood or atmosphere, but as a, quote, dimension, end quote, that renders visible emotion in its purest state. In the facial close-up, he thus continues, pages 100 through 101, block quote, the position of the eyes in the top half of the face, the mouth below, wrinkles now to the right, now to the left. None of this now retains its spatial significance. For what we see is merely a single expression. We see emotions and thoughts. We see something that does not exist in space. End of block quote. In a significant move, Balazs now turns to a second source to explain his new understanding of the extraspatial dimension of the facial close-up, to Henry Bergson, and specifically to Bergson's writing on duration and time. Balazs had personal contact with Bergson during a stay in Paris in 1911 through 1912. He also discussed Bergson with Semmel, whose private seminar on the philosophy of art he began attending in 1906, in a period when Semmel and Bergson were engaged in ongoing dialogue on questions of space-time perception and the phenomenology of modern life. Bergson's significance for Balazs is evident in his revised understanding of the temporality of the facial close-up in the spirit of film. In his Essai sur les données immédiates de la conscience, Time and Free Will, 1889, Bergson suggests that time is conventionally understood spatially by reflective consciousness. As Suzanne Gerlach explains, the, quote, conventional concept of time, end quote, is seen by Bergson as false, quote, a quote, bastard concept, end quote, which results from the intrusion of an idea of space into the domain of pure consciousness, end of quote. Time is reduced in human consciousness because we conceive of it as progressing through a linear development from past to present and future. If, however, we consider time not in the terms of categories derived from, quote, reflective consciousness, end quote, which abstracts from lived time and calculates it in terms of a spatial progression, and consider instead the alternative temporalities of immediate experience and inner states, then we arrive at a concept of what Berghahn calls, quote, pure duration, end quote. Duration, duree, is the, quote, form taken by the succession of our inner states of consciousness when our self abstains from establishing a separation between the present state and anterior states, end quote. Paradoxically, therefore, as Gerlach continues, quote, to think the temporality of duration, we must first be willing to give up our conceptual separation of past and present in order to conceive of temporal synthesis per se, end quote. Bergson's figure for duration is melody, which achieves the temporal synthesis that duration demands by working with a, quote, notion of ensemble in which state and feelings overlap or interpenetrate one another, end quote. Bala cites Berghahn on melody in The Spirit of Film in a passage that offers the facial close-up as a visual correlative of musical melody, and thus as a window on a physiognomic dimension that he locates within the fluid time of Bergsonian duration. Block quote. Physiognomy has a relation to space comparable to that existing between melody and time. The facial muscles that make expression possible may be close to each other in space, but it is their relation to one another that creates expression. These relations have no extinction and no direction in space, no more than do feelings and thoughts, ideas and associations. All these are image-like in nature and yet non-spatial. Page 101. This represents a progression from visible man. Here, Bala envisages a utopian transcendence of the instrumental rationality of bourgeois time, not through close-ups that situate the film image in the simultaneity of fairy tale time. For simultaneity itself implies a spatialization of time, a juxtaposition of past and future in the present's enchanted space. The facial close-up, by contrast, has the capacity to stage an encounter with an ensemble of expressive elements, a twitch of the facial muscles, a frown, a wailing eye, that together comprise, quote, a multiplicity in which states or feelings overlap or interpenetrate one another, instead of being organized into a distinct succession, end quote. The facial close-up, then, opens up within the film text a dimension in which time is released from the spatial confines and flows forth with the rhythm and tempo of pure duration which Bala had once discovered in the face of Gish. Marxism and montage. Bala himself indicates in The Spirit of the Film that the significance of Berghahn for his thinking is not confined to the close-up. As he writes, the issue of durée, a dimension that lies at the heart of his vision in this volume of film as, quote, visible spirit, end quote, is also one that, quote, we shall return to in connection with the montage, end quote, page 101. Balaj devotes long sections of both Visible Man and The Spirit of Film to montage, a cinematic process that he identifies in the later text as one of the three fundamental components. The others are the close-up and the camera setup of the language of film. His further identification of the montage as the element which makes apparent, quote, the essential factor, namely the work's composition, end quote, page 98, may in part be read as a side swipe at Eisenstein, with whom he had clashed 4 years previously in a famous quarrel over montage. In 1926, Balaj was invited to Berlin by the Club der Kameraleute Deutschlands, German Cameramen's Club, to deliver a lecture on photography and film. The club's director, the virtuoso cinematographer Karl Freund, was sufficiently enthusiastic to invite Balaj to write a film scenario for Freund's production company, Vox Europa Productions. The resultant lost film, The Adventures of a 10-Mark Note, 1926, became the first of a long line of successful German productions scripted by Balaj, including Jonas Gutter's Grand Hotel, 1927, Kurt Bernhardt's Das Mädchen mit von Nullen, The Big Win, 1927, an early adaptation of Stefan Zweig's Letter from an Unknown Woman, Narcosis, Alfred Abel, and 1929, and most contentiously, G.W. Pabst Die Schraubgrubenscharpenoper, The Threepenny Opera, 1930, a title that would involve Balaj tangentially in the bitter legal wrangle that was the culmination of ideological and aesthetic disputes between Pabst, Brecht, and Will. The clash with Brecht had uncomfortable echoes of Balaj's earlier dispute with Eisenstein. Balaj had moved to Berlin in 1926 and began at this point a feverish engagement in Marxist cultural production and organization that encompassed work with Willy Muzzenberger's Prometheus film, preparing Soviet films for German release, activities as a member of the dramaturgical collective for Erwin Piscator's Proletarian Theater, the Piscator Bone, participation alongside Pabst, Piscator, Freund, and others in the Volksverband für Filmkunst, People's Association for Film Art, and after 1929, involvement in revolutionary drama as a member of the Bund Proletarische Revolutionäre Schriftsteller Deutschland, Association of Proletarian Revolutionary Writers in Germany. When Eisenstein launched his public attack on Balaj in his satirical quote, Balaj Forgets the Scissors, end quote, 1926, it was thus not Balaj's ideological commitment that was in question, but rather the aesthetic theory underpinning his account of montage. Eisenstein's ear is roused by Balaj's naming of the cameraman in his 1926 lecture as, quote, the alpha and the omega of film, end quote, taking Balaj to task as a bourgeois individualist in whose film theory both the cameraman as the film artist and the individual shot play the role of the, quote, star, end quote. Eisenstein summarizes his own alternative view of film as a medium that approaches the, quote, symbolism of language, speech, end quote, through the, quote, contextual confrontation, end quote, between images effected by the montage. Eisenstein identifies three tendencies in contemporary montage, quote, American montage, end quote, which subordinates editing to narrative, Soviet montage, which operates through a dialectical interaction of shots to produce a new idea, and montage in German cinema, which Eisenstein sees as conceiving the shot only in isolation. Balazs, he contends, falls into the, quote, German, end quote, trap of conceiving film as an art of the image alone and failing to grasp montage as the medium's fundamentally new, quote, opportunity and element, end quote. Eisenstein's account of Balazs's film theory is to some extent inaccurate, since Balazs had by this point written extensively on montage, not least in Visible Man. But he is correct in identifying in Balazs the representative of a theoretical tendency that sits uneasily with Eisenstein's understanding of a montage of attractions as the source of new meanings in film. In The Spirit of Film, Balazs would later criticize both the, quote, hieroglyphic, end quote, penchant that he identifies in some Soviet film, its reduction of meaning to, quote, ideograms, end quote, page 128, in the, quote, intellectual film, end quote, that, quote, depicts neither stories nor destinies, neither private nor social fates, but only ideas, end quote, page 149. His critique reaches back to passages in Visible Man, where he had begun to elaborate in alternative accounts which, far from subordinating montage to the image, situates both within a Bergsonian vision of the film physiognomy as a window onto, quote, the movement of life itself, end quote, page 67. Invisible Man, Balazs is still casting around for a terminology adequate to his understanding of the vital fluidity of montage. His term at this point is Bilderführung, literally, quote, leading the image along, end quote, or, quote, image direction, end quote. This present translation uses a term more usually associated with Pudovkin, quote, linkage, end quote, partly in recognition of Pudovkin's admiration for the Balazs of Visible Man. But the term also draws attention to the specificity of Balazs's understanding of montage as a process that builds on what is in any case the fluid and directional quality of the visual image to produce films that, quote, flow smoothly and in a broad stream like the hexameter in a classical epic, or else like a ballad flaring up breathlessly and then dying down again, like a drama rising inexorably towards a climax or tingling capriciously, end quote, page 67. Balazs's concluding definition of linkage in this passage as film's, quote, living breath, end quote, page 67, highlights the affinity between his anthropomorphic understanding of montage and his account of objects and figures in close-up as animated by the rhythm and tempo of a poetic inner life. In Visible Man, he thus attributes to linkage the same poetic qualities, simultaneism, page 70, rhythm and tempo, page 72, that render movement in close-up as, quote, the expression of an increased intensity, end quote, and connect the close shot to the, quote, internal rhythms of the mental world, end quote, page 49. Like the close-up, montage operates in the affective temporality of poetry and the dream, rendering time as a, quote, mood, end quote, not an, quote, objective fact, end quote, page 68. And Just as Balage's account of the close-up developed in the 7 years between his writing of Visible Man and The Spirit of Film towards a more explicitly Bergsonian account of the close shot as the site of a new experiential, quote, dimension, end quote, so too his work on montage shifts towards an understanding of editing as blending, quote, tempos and forms, movements and directions, as well as emphases on elements of the direction or of the action, end quote, into a, quote, mobile formation, end quote, that shifts the film into a, quote, sixth dimension, a rhythmic formation that is experienced optically and yet is not visible, end quote, page 131. Both Eisenstein and Podovkin would later similarly emphasize the significance of rhythm as the compositional element that lends structure and unity to film. But whereas for Eisenstein that unity, quote, emerges from the content and imagery of the work, end quote, and is thus apprehended symbolically, the unity of film art is experienced for Balage through a process of, quote, sinuous apperception, end quote, page 125, and, quote, induction, end quote, page 123, in which the, quote, shape, end quote, gestalt, page 128, of film is revealed as a, quote, stream of relationships flowing like, quote, optical music, end quote, page 129, across the fluid surface of the montage. The durational quality of this, quote, optical music, end quote, is illuminated in an eloquent passage on spectatorship in which Balage identifies not melody, as in his account of the close-up, but dance as the source of a movement that evokes the durational flow of time. Bergson himself had used the example of dance as a form that, quote, lets us see the reality of flowing time, end quote. Balage echoes his former mentor in a rhapsodic passage where he equates film spectatorship to the dance of inner life. Block quote. If directional montage has a suggestive rhythm, then the rhythm it suggests is that of dance. Dance is the ornament of movement. The point of view of the camera becomes the spectator's point of view. When it changes, so too does the point of the spectator. Even if he does not move an inch, he moves inwardly. Page 131. The cosmopolitan body. If for Balage, in sum, the montage facilitates a mode of cinematic perception that moves to the rhythm and tempo, the, quote, living breath, end quote, of the spectator's inner life, then this places him not, as Eisenstein suggested, on the side of the pictorialism, which Eisenstein identified as a characteristic of German film. Instead, Balage assumes a place within the history of aesthetic theory that locates him, first, on Gough's side of the physiognomic dispute with Lavater, and second, in a phenomenological tradition that stretches back through Simmel to Henry Bergson. Yet the anthropocentric emphasis in Balage's aesthetic, his insistence that the technological industrial dead matter of film is animated by a bodily poetics whose aesthetic qualities are those of music, lyric poetry, and dance, poses a final question for his theory of film. There is a profoundly shocking passage in Visible Man that reminds the modern reader of the perils of a film theory that celebrates the culture of the physical body. Block quote. We may say that the language of gestures has become standardized in film. It contains the first living seeds of the standard white man who will one day emerge as the synthesis of the mix of different races and peoples. The cinematograph is a machine that, in its own way, will create a living, concrete internationalism, the unique shared psyche of the white man. We can go further by suggesting a uniform ideal of beauty as the universal goal of selective breeding. The film will help to produce a uniform type of the white race. Page 14. End of block quote. Ballard starkly voices here the contradiction at the heart of his account of the filmic body. On the one hand, film for Ballard, as for many of his contemporaries, represented the realization of the Enlightenment cosmopolitan dream of a, quote, living, concrete internationalism, end quote, a, quote, brotherhood, end quote, of man, and I use the male gender advisedly, united in a common language, common ethical values, and a common commitment to universal rights and freedoms. At the same time, Ballard topples headlong into the ideological trap laid by an Enlightenment universalism that seeks to embrace a common humanity, but simultaneously inscribes the, quote, enlightened, end quote, human subject as white, European, and male. Ballard did later shift ground from the racial essentialism of this passage. In Theory of the Film, he replaces Visible Man's racial analysis of film's universalist potential with a Marxist account that locates cinematic internationalism as the product of film's penetration of international markets. The newly cultural relativist Ballard now concedes that film's task is not to ground a new racial hierarchy that privileges the, quote, universal white man, end quote, but instead to, quote, aid in leveling physical differences between the various races and nations, end quote, and thus to serve the, quote, common cause, end quote, of, quote, uniting men within the limits of their own race and nation, end quote. Yet, there are reasons to tarry briefly with the earlier Ballard and to use the provocation of his passage on the, quote, standard white man, end quote, to explore potentially productive contradictions within his theory of the body in film. The early polarization of the Soviet reception of Ballard between the camps of Eisenstein and Berghahn was typical of the ideological divisions that regularly formed around his theory of film art. Acclaimed on the one hand by leftist modernists including Berghahn, Piscator, and Freund, Ballard was later celebrated by Third Reich theorists for his insights on film rhythm as the, quote, movement of excitation that transmits itself like an electric current to the unconscious, end quote, an excitation that Wolfgang Liebeneer, for instance, saw as forging a bond between the film spectator and the rhythmic movements of Nazism's militarized social totality. There is no doubt that it was Ballard's early allegiance to race theory that made his work available for appropriation by Nazi film ideologues. It was certainly also his horror at the racial madness of the Nazi regime that accounted for his more orthodox Marxist reworking of the earlier passage in Theory of the Film. But the rearrangement with Ballard's early film theory that this present volume attempts us to see elements already within his interwar theory of the filmic body that rendered untenable his repudiation of racial otherness. There are outlined above ways of rereading Ballard that illuminate the very different, fluid, multiplicitous, libidinous relation to the other that is always and simultaneously evident in his work on the body on film. That relationship resonates more, or that relationship resonates moreover with the renewed interest in 21st century cultural studies and cultural theory in what Micah Nava has termed a vernacular and, quote, visceral, end quote, cosmopolitanism, a cosmopolitanism understood not in terms of formal political structures or institutional arrangements, but as, quote, part of the structure of feeling associated with, quote, modernity, end quote, that is to say, with a mood and historical moment which highlighted the fluidity and excitement of modern metropolitan life and culture and signaled a positive engagement with difference, end quote. Nava is joined by other writers from within philosophy and social theory, Kwame Anthony Appiah, Salah Benhabib, and in different register, Zygmunt Bauman, all of whom seek to rescue the cosmopolitan tradition for our, quote, globalized, end quote, times. What these writers promote is far more than merely a pleasurable identification with difference. Indeed, as Bowman points out, this is a mode of identification in which the other becomes an object of consumption, not a subject embraced through what he terms, quote, liquid love, end quote. More than this, what the, quote, living concrete internationalism, end quote, Ballage of everyday cosmopolitanism demands is a surrender of the sovereign self to the ambivalence of intersubjectivity, a muddying of self-other boundaries of precisely the kind of Ballage's phenomenology of film promotes. Ballage offered his Spirit of Film in 1930 in part as a defense of the sound film against contemporaries. Rudolf Arnheim was one for whom the advent of sound meant the death of film art. One film released that same year and thus not yet discussed by Ballage can serve as a vindication of his claim that while silent film, quote, liberated the visible human being from the constricted framework of the stage and inserted him into the ever-present totality of his environment, end quote, the same liberation, quote, is now on the horizon for auditory man, end quote, page 141 or 142. Augusto Janina's 1930 pre-debut Miss Europe, scripted by Renee Clare and featuring Louise Brooks in the last of her starring roles in European film, centers on Brooks' rise and demise as a beauty queen. She wins at a Miss Europa contest but finds only tragedy in her new life as a public beauty. The film opens with a scene in a Sunday swimming pool that celebrates the same bodily dynamism that Ballage attributes to the film medium tout court. The scene's mobile mood is captured by the camera's swooping pans in and around the swimmers' bodies, by dissolves that sustain the rhythm of movement across and between those bodies, by accelerating montage that emphasizes the energy of the crowd, by fragmented body parts, legs, arms, hands, and repetitive patterns of movement across the shots that show individual bodies dispersing into a collective experience of physical pleasure. The fleeting shot of a film camera offering for sale filmed footage of this Sunday jamboree reminds the viewer, meanwhile, that The sensual pleasures are celebrated here gain added piquancy through their instantaneous capture in and consumption through the photographic image. The utopian cosmopolitanism that Balage's film theory celebrates is visible from four distinct perspectives, both in the sequence from Miss Europe and in his theory of the filmic body. Identification with the body of the other occurs first for Balaj and Janina through equivalences, established in particular through the use of close up between animate bodies and body parts and the inanimate world of things. Thus, gramophone that features in close up amongst the Janina's teeming crowd takes on the equivalent symbolic significance to a hand, an arm, a body in motion. Gertrude Koch refers in this text to what she calls Balage's democratization of the image under a cinematic gaze for which, quote, all objects assume the dignity of aesthetic perception and sublimation, end quote. Such equivalences are secondly fostered for Balage through a montage that privileges linkage over dissonance, an editing style whose emphasis on formal repetition, shared rhythms and tempos, common directions, and flows of movement illuminates the commonalities across and between animate and inanimate bodies. The gramophone, the ice cream, the human hand on film. Thirdly, bodily identification occurs paradoxically through the dispersal and fragmentation of the human body, both as representation and as perceptual organism. In Miss Europe, bodies and objects are dispersed into part objects, but reassembled as an experiential totality through the mobile camera and fluid montage. But the film also illustrates a further claim from Balage, which is that in film, the human body itself is fractured into individual perceptual organs, eye, ear, and somatic processes, the breath of life, which in turn meld with the technological apparatus, the eye with the camera, the ear with the microphone, rhythmic breath with the rhythm of the montage, to produce a human subject whose perception merges with the technological apparatus of cinema and through this with the perception of the viewing collectivity. This technological collectivization of perception may, as Balage admits in Theory of the Film, open the way to mass manipulation by the film industrial apparatus, but it is always also simultaneously, he continues to insist, the source of what Hyde Schlopman will later term a, quote, solidarity with the perception of the other, end quote, through the medium of film. The solidarity is realized, fourthly and finally, in Balage's understanding of both spectatorship and performance in terms of embodied identification that flow across and between the cinematic apparatus, the body of the spectator and the bodies on film. Balage was repeatedly preoccupied in his film writings with the body and performance. Visible Man ends, for instance, with a paean of praise to Asta Nielsen, a favorite of Balage, in whose film performance of Wedekind's Lulu he discerns an, quote, block quote, erotic charisma that regales us with the great and complete dictionary of the gestures of sensual love. It now becomes clear that the erotic is film's very own theme, its essence. First, because it is always a bodily experience, experience, at least in part, and is therefore visible. Secondly, it is only in erotic relationships that we find an ultimate possibility of mute understanding, page 91, emphasis Balaj, end of block quote. For Nielsen, the quote dictionary, end quote, of erotic gestures on which she drew in her films included a repertoire of exotic dance forms, most famously the quote gaucho dance, end quote, in Argentine herdsman's dance with Boladores in Lasso that she performed in her breakthrough title to film stardom, Urban Gad's 1910 Afgrunden, The Abyss. Nelson's sinuous, writhing body as she ensnares a hapless gaucho in her lasso oscillates between a repudiation of the erotic other, a use of her own body to substitute for and repress experience of the quote Apache end quote woman she mimics, and quote mute understanding end quote Balaj, or what Jan Campbell has called an quote embodied mimesis end quote, a performance that through its mimicry also remembers the repressed other and brings it into representation within her performing body on film. The ambivalent performance of a film artist who was for Balaj a figure, quote, incomparable and without peer, end quote, page 94, pinpoints then, finally, the challenge of Balaj for contemporary readers, the demand that just as we engage with and work through the uncomfortable tension in Nelson's dancing body between an embrace and a repudiation of cultural difference, so too we should confront Balaj's early accounts of the audiovisual body with his own cosmopolitan ethic and excavate from the tension between the two a more comprehensive understanding of the ambivalent ethico-political heritage delivered by film to, quote, visible man. And I was reading the introduction to Bela Balaj, Early Film Theory, Visible Man, and the Spirit of Film by Bela Balaj and edited by Erica Carter.